Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started here in about 5 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, but feel free to hop in, chit chat, ask some pre-webinar questions. We're going to make this as interactive and as fun as we possibly can with a big group. We have quite a few people registered, so this will be interesting how this plays out on a panel. Everybody hear us okay? Curious if anybody else can speak as well.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Got it.
I can hear you both.
Fantastic.
Excellent.
Great to see people showing up. Elad, nice to see you, man. Big group showing up already.
Yeah, looking forward to it. It's going to be an interesting one.
Well, it'll only be interesting if you bring some of your commentary. So.
We can just add him to the panel just right now, right? We'll just unofficial.
Yeah, we're definitely going to keep this interactive, and so anybody that does have questions, we do have I believe a Q&A chat that should allow you to type your question if you don't want to talk, but you are welcome to hop in and ask your question via voice or add to the discussion as we kind of bring people in and out. And if you have any insights into things that we are talking about, feel free. Funny is we're putting this panel together, the amount of information and changing landscape and companies and actors that are doing things on an hourly basis is something else. I keep trying to update my notes with newer and newer things, and just at some point you have to stop.
Yeah, I feel like we should show everybody a screenshot of what your notes looks like because your brain is a scary place to be. Who makes a OneNote that is like this wide?
That's why I end up using mind maps so much, because it spiders everywhere. So really, it really just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have it in a box. Obviously, I'm not good with boxes.
Let's see. Hey, Robin, I think is asking about recording. You did kick that off, right, Tyler? It looks like it is recording. Or Sean did.
Yes, we got the recording going. This will be recorded, and we will make it available to people after. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
We may need to filter out.
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely know people's time, especially during the day, is very difficult and very busy. So we try and make the recording available for passing it to the team and being able to look at it later. Additionally, like, how does everybody feel about Thursdays? Is Thursdays typically a good day? We thought later in the week, not the end of the week, not the beginning, not at the hump of the week. That really kind of leaves Thursday. So we've opted for Thursday, but realizing that there may be other days that make more sense to a lot of people.
I'm going to post that in the Q&A. I'm just now learning how to do this. I
Well,
think you can just like thumb up it. Can you see them?
Looks like it.
Yeah.
And we used Teams quite a bit for different presentations and styles. This is one of the first times we've done a panel, the Teams panel kind of interface. So this is kind of fun that everybody can interact and engage if they want to. So we're going to see how well this platform works out from from that standpoint and allow everyone to kind of get involved, get engaged. Show your video if you want, chit chat. It adds a lot more robustness to the discussion, being able to have others' insights, and especially with the kind of people that are showing up in here. It's good to see you guys.
Absolutely. Welcome, everyone. So it is 2:01. So we're going to get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining. This is our first panel. So this is going to be interesting. It's a little bit different from us. I've done AMAs before. I think we'll probably do a Trimarc AMA at some point, talk about some of the things that we've been seeing and some challenges in environments. But this is our first panel, and we have Tyler Robinson, who has been red teaming a large number of organizations for probably a decade or more. And we have Brandon Colley, who has been in operations for a long time and shifted over to security. Actually did a talk at PancakeSCon earlier this year, which is very well represented and well liked about Active Directory and Active Directory security. And myself, Sean Metcalf, founder and CTO of Trimarc, also a Microsoft Certified Master in Active Directory. So we want this panel to be interactive. So we're going to basically start off with the introductions, which is this, and then Tyler's going to talk about what we've been seeing from a ransomware perspective. We do have a group that tracks ransomware and attackers as far as what's going on in the industry, what people are, the challenges they have. We also work very closely with some industry representation across insurance and incident response and others. So we have a pretty good idea of what's happening as well, what's been reported, as well as what doesn't make it to the news. So Tyler's going to set the stage with what ransomware is doing, as well as how APTs may be leveraging that perspective. Then we're going to shift over into some questions that we have pre-established for the panel that they may or may not have seen before, which is Tyler, Brandon, and myself. And we definitely want everyone on this call to please ask some questions. You can either come off mute at certain points, or go ahead and post it into the Q&A if you do have questions, or you can put it in the chat. So whichever works for the folks on here. We want this to be a discussion as much as possible. And it is scheduled for an hour. So probably about the first half of that is going to be us talking, and then we want to have some interaction on the second half of it. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Tyler to talk about some of the ransomware stuff. I'm going to talk a little bit about how that relates to what we've seen in assessments, and then we'll go from there. So Tyler.
Thanks, Sean. Appreciate that introduction, and welcome everybody. Appreciate you guys showing up, taking your Thursday afternoon to be with us. The ransomware landscape is very interesting. We start to look at and think about why this landscape is important. Now, if you're in security or in IT, you obviously know what ransomware is. You know a lot of the stuff you've seen in the news. It seems like there's new stuff happening every day. That being said, it's a very adaptive and changing landscape, and there's a few reasons why you really do need to kind of stay on top of what is changing, so you can speak intelligently to your executives, to your board, be able to have that insight and be the subject matter expert around what's going on. Two, really understanding the actors from the inside out and knowing what their tactics are, how they're changing and adapting, and what groups to be concerned about based on what vertical you're in, what technologies you're running. All of those things become important because you may be protected or think you're protected for a lot of what you knew originally. Call it 2019, 2020. We've seen some huge changes and shifts from ransomware as a service. So really starting to think about what is changing and what your risk profile and threat profile is has to adapt and has to be able to migrate with these actors and ransomware itself. So what's a few of the trends that we're seeing, and specifically from 2021 to 2022 now, what are we starting to see in 2022? Obviously, you've seen a lot of stuff in the news where Conti, the biggest ransomware gang, they had ransomed the most people in 2021. Even up until Q2 2022, they were still responsible for the Costa Rican government ransom. They had the most victims, and they were a very well-run business and had a good platform and means to do that ransom. So what has changed with the Conti going under? Well, not a lot. There's a lot of new threat actors coming up, and there's different techniques. So that's lended itself to different tactics that is allowing new tooling and different operators to now shift into other groups. Now that's important because the tactics in ransomware as a service, which is begotten much easier, we're starting to see these tools become simpler for anybody to use. And that's a very important distinction. Before we had hands behind keyboard, actually even before that, we had automated scripts that would ransom something, someone opened something and it dropped a file and automatically ransom stuff. We've got protections, things get detected. You move forward a little bit and you have hands on keyboard now, and you have people that were doing the ransomware. And still there was some detection. You're able to protect yourself and usually get in front of that to a certain extent. With what we're seeing now, we're starting to see that anybody is able to leverage the ransomware as a service platform in order to do the ransoms. And you see this new ecosystem of the initial access brokers or the botnets. You have things like Quackbot or Bumblebee, all of these different botnets that exist, Emotet. The botnets exist in order to provide and load the ransomware as a service binary for the affiliates and get them easier access. So you can actually purchase the initial access from initial access brokers, which is entirely separate threat actors, different groups that's all they focus on. You can purchase that access and then gain access into an environment and then begin to execute the malware as a service, which is highly undetectable, very modular and dynamic. And so now anybody has the ability with a little bit of money and investment to start to ransom places, and you're essentially becoming a business broker at that point, and you have to be less technical. And so we've seen this shift where it's becoming a much more business focused, much nicer UI, different capabilities. And the threat actors and ransomware groups have shifted to a much more professional look that's allowed them to go into the double, triple extortion. And even as far as 2022, we look at the Lockbit version 3. They have some new things that they're trying to do. You can buy more time, like you've got a timer on your data before it gets leaked for the double extortion. Now you can buy more time, so you get these add-on benefits. Or you can purchase the extortion data, which is actually terrifying as you look at like APTs or actors that are trying to gain access to specific organizations that may not be working with these ransomware groups. You can just actually go buy the data that is being ransomed off or being threatened to be leaked. And then you have the destruction option, where you can just opt in to have your data destroyed. If you got good backups, great. You don't want your data leaked. Okay, now you just pay us a smaller fee in order to just destroy that data. So we're seeing a little bit more creativity and a little bit more business model put behind these actors and the ransomware as a service platforms, which has a lot of things that must be considered from an executive level in your risk profile and how you deal with that. We're going to talk through some of the questions kind of around what you should do as an organization and some of our personal opinions on, should we be paying the ransom? What does not paying provide? All of these things kind of come into play, and you really have to preemptively think about these strategies prior to being ransomed. You really should have a playbook, have ran through some tabletop exercises, worked with some of your security vendors and consultants that have an idea on how this stuff works, so that you know what your process is going to be. You need to be able to involve your PR. You need to be able to involve your legal. Who do you respond and report these breaches to in order to be inside of compliance? All these things you don't want to be doing during a very heavy stress incident in which your data is going to be leaked. So making sure that you have that kind of understanding is very important. So we're going to talk through some of those things, as well as some of the mitigations that are coming into play. But as far as what the actors are doing, we still see a lot of the same stuff. And this is kind of the sad side of what ransomware is doing. We're still seeing a lot of the same type of social engineering, phishing emails. We're seeing a lot of password spraying, so that once they gain access into your email client or to your O365 tenancy, they're just hijacking email threads and pretending to be a vendor, supply chain, someone with inside of the organization. Provides them a high fidelity way to interact with different places and begin to look at the vulnerabilities, technologies, and methods in which they're going to start to extort you. So they may not even have all the data exfilled from your environment, but they have a good idea of what data is important to you and what they can say they have or begin to say that they're ransoming, and begin the thread very early in the process. And so this is something else to keep in mind as you're beginning the negotiation. You're really starting to think about where your vulnerabilities are. Think about what your important data is to your organization, and think of that from an attacker standpoint. What an attacker thinks is your important data may not be what your main focus or goal is. As a database admin, your main focus and goal is your database. However, your vertical may be industrial controls or systems that provide manufacturing. You don't want downtime on that, because that is a very critical aspect to the business. And that may be the most important thing that we're seeing a lot of the ransomware attackers go after, is things that cause downtime rather than the data itself. Those are shifts in different tactics from different groups, and that really does depend on the group. And so as we think about some of those, we're going to offer some insights and some protections that you can leverage, because again, phishing is phishing. We've seen Microsoft's big shift now for the macro blocking, and then subsequent unblocking, and then the subsequent unblocking of the block. So now we're back to the place where Microsoft by default is blocking macros. That's a great step. However, we've had the ability to block macros for decades. So why is this such a big issue, and why are more people not doing this? There's business reasons. There's lots of things that happen, but this is the type of easy things that ransomware is going after and leveraging. The ransomware phishing, the social engineering, the password spraying, and then in some cases, in small cases, we've seen more of this over the last, we'll call it the last 6 months, especially since the Ukraine-Russia war. We've seen a lot of 0 days come out that affect endpoint VPNs or exposed SaaS services or exposed services from the enterprise. Now, each of those are going to have their own vulnerabilities, and you have to address those in those cases. And this is where we're starting to recommend putting things behind VPNs that really have any kind of authentication. We'll get more into that, but these shifts around the simple things that are exposed externally and the ways that you've traditionally been attacked, those are all pretty much the same. So try not to identify the IOCs and really get the behavior and understand the tactics that these ransomware groups are using, and put the root cause mitigations in place so that you can begin to address these at a high level. And that way, when the attackers change their tactics, but the behavior is the same, you're still protected. And these are important nuances. So we'll kind of dive in on the panel a little bit. There are some interesting questions I actually don't know the answer to. I want to hear what Sean's personal opinion is, and kind of where some of the protections and things that Brandon has seen in his time managing large operations. I want to see some of their experience. And so, Sean, I think the first one I really want to know is what is your personal opinion on whether an organization should pay a ransom, and in what circumstances do you feel that there may be a reason to pay the ransom?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's certainly been quite the debate raging for the past few years. Definitely in 2020, we saw ransomware explode. Certainly as COVID grew, we saw more remote access happening. They gave attackers the ability to get into systems more easily, because all of a sudden, all these companies that were on premises where they had to be in the office, all of a sudden now everyone's working from home. So how do you first of all know who's connecting in, and second of all, how do you know that they are the only one that's connected in on that connection? So we definitely had a lot of conversations with companies in 2020 about protecting remote access, using things like VPN. Certainly app proxy, which is available through Azure AD, is an exceptional technology. Certainly other vendors have something similar. But yeah, as far as pay versus not to pay, so my initial response is that you should not pay, with an asterisk, because the issue is that you have an active attacker on your network. Ransomware could be just part of the problem. If you pay, from what I've read, and Tyler, you can correct me if I'm wrong, there is a percentage chance that if you pay, you will actually be able to get access to your data. But that is not 100%. Ransomware actors make mistakes, and sometimes the code that they use to encrypt doesn't always allow for decrypting. So If you pay, you might be in a situation where you've paid a lot of money. And again, my understanding is that a lot of these payments are done through third-party brokers. You pay a broker in cash through some sort of money transfer. I've heard about people delivering bags of cash in a parking lot. And then these days, the broker actually converts that into Bitcoin and then makes the payment to the ransomware actor. Again, when you have made this payment, there's no guarantee. It's just like any sort of ransom. I mean, we've seen plenty of movies where someone's like, all right, we paid the ransom. What happened? Nothing happened. So yes, you can get the decryption key in order to decrypt the data. But the important thing to remember is they had initial access somehow, whether that was access that the ransomware actor paid for, whether they stumbled across it through phishing, like Tyler mentioned, or it could just be potentially a smokescreen for some other bigger operation. So I would say that the most important thing you can do is work on the low-hanging fruit, certainly through the things that we published at Trimarc. We published our Active Directory security check script, as well as an article on how to do that. We did a webcast last month, which is on the Trimarc YouTube channel, about how to quickly improve Active Directory security, like the top 10 things you can do. Those are the important things to do to set yourself up to be in a better situation, so that if you do have ransomware, it has less of an impact. Tyler mentioned backups. As part of our assessments, one of the things we look at, especially for Active Directory security assessment, is backups. How are they being done? We check to see if there's a Microsoft supported backup being performed. I'd say in about 50%, probably 45% of our Active Directory security assessments, we see there's not a good backup, not a good recent backup, and not a Microsoft supported backup. So that begs the question, what is a supported backup from an Active Directory perspective? That means that there is the Microsoft determined and identified method for backing up Active Directory so it can be recovered, so that AD itself understands that that backup has been performed and this recovery is an authorized or authenticated restoration. So there's a lot of systems out there that do backup, but they do not actually flip the bits that are necessary for it to be a Microsoft supported backup. We've worked with customers that have had to recover from ransomware, and they basically gave, metaphorically, big bags of money to Commvault and to Microsoft in order to recover. I'm using Commvault as an example from one of the customers that we worked with. It costs a lot of money to recover from that sort of situation. It is as important to have good Active Directory recovery systems and setup and process where it's tested, because I love using the Seinfeld phrase, they know how to take the reservation, they just don't know how to hold the reservation. It's the same thing with backups. You can take backups as much as you want, but until you've tested it, you don't know that you actually have a good backup in your environment and that you can fully recover. So there's certainly the data perspective of it. I was actually on site at a customer location in Europe, I think it was in 2018, doing training there, and they were hit by ransomware while I was there. Thankfully, they had a new big system, I believe it was an EMC system that they had implemented, which was doing basically full backups on a regular basis and doing snapshots of deltas throughout the day. And so there was a specific share that got hit where a lot of their important stuff and data was being stored and updated. And they were able to recover within an hour because of that method and that system that they had set up. Not many organizations can say that. So certainly when it comes to ransomware, it's what is your recoverability? Has it been tested? As Tyler mentioned, where is your sensitive data? Where's your critical data? We launched a new service earlier this year called the Enterprise Security Posture Assessment, or Trimarc ESP. And one of the things that we work with customers through this, especially the larger customers, is what are your most sensitive systems? What are your most critical systems? What are the ones that would just devastate your business if these were affected negatively, if these were attacked, if these were dropped, if ransomware hit that? And that's really what we designed the ESP around, was really trying to frustrate attackers, frustrate ransomware, is what are those edges? How do those things connect? More than what we just look at from an Active Directory standpoint or an Azure AD standpoint or a VMware standpoint. So the question around should you pay is obviously a nuanced one. If you're in a situation where you're a hospital, and it hurts my heart that ransomware actors are actually hitting hospitals or medical facilities, where people will die, that is insane from a human perspective. But if you're a hospital and you have to keep people on life support and you have to keep them operating, and your recovery time is an hour, and you need to keep people operating, and operations happening, literal operations happening in the hospital, keep people alive, and you have a window of like 5 to 10 minutes, yeah, unfortunately, you're probably going to have to pay in that situation. There are going to be situations where you're going to have to pay, but keep in mind that when the ransomware has hit your environment, it's because there's some sort of avenue into that environment, some sort of access. We're hearing from our partners in the industry that service accounts are the most prevalent access point for attackers to get escalated privileges in the environment. So what does this mean for you? Evaluate, look at the service accounts. What are the rights that they have? We went through this whole issue with SolarWinds, with all the rights that SolarWinds had. Trimarc had worked with CISA on a number of things around this, as mentioned by Jenna Easterly at the Black Hat keynote last year. There are things that you can do, and one of the probably most important things that you can do is look at privileged access. Who are your Active Directory administrators? Who are your VMware administrators? Who have privileged access and administrative control to the environment, and how are those credentials protected? I know that at Trimarc, we talk about this a lot. We've published a lot about it. I published on adsecurity.org for many years about this. But ironically, or maybe counterintuitively, it is these simple things, maybe not simple, but the foundational type things that we've been talking about for years that are the most important things that you can do to improve the security environment. A lot of the low-hanging fruit will frustrate the attackers to the point where maybe they move on to the next step. So I'll pass it over to Brandon based on his experience and see what Brandon has to say about pay versus not pay.
Not nearly as much as you had to say about it. Yeah, so I mean, I totally agree with the whole not pay. And most of it, I think, is the really interesting question that comes into play is you're checking against the integrity of the person who just is ransoming you, right? So do they have a good, like, you go research them on like
So like in Yelp for ransomware actors?
Yeah, like the Better Business Bureau for ransomware. Like, are these guys, are they actually going to decrypt my files, or like you said, did they screw it up? Or so, I mean, that's just the weird mental thing that I kind of keep going back to is that. But yeah, I think the thing that interests me is I've always wondered is how many people actually do pay. And so Tyler, I think you had maybe a little bit of information about that.
Yeah, I've got some stats kind of around that, and there are some nuances to keep in mind when you are dealing with ransomware. There are a few things that play through most people's mind, and that is you're dealing with a hacker, you're dealing with an attacker, people without morals. That being said, many of the ransomware groups, they really do operate and kind of live on the fact that their reputation to be able to decrypt is valid. And that's why we've seen such heavy emphasis on development and iterations on tools. Like you look at the iteration between Lockbit, which started as ABCD and moved to 1, 2, and we're already on 3. These tools have gotten to the point where they are so fast at exfilling data that we don't even have comparable commercial tools that move data that fast. And they're really, really good at ensuring that each of the files are recoverable. Now, that's not to say that you should pay because you're going to get them back, but there are a lot of these ransomware gangs that do work on a reputation. And so you even see things as nuanced as individual affiliates. You have to upload a certain number of files into the admin panel in order to get the offset, so that individual affiliates are ensured that they're the ones that ransom that, and they're the ones that are the only ones that can get the decryption key. And so they're validating that the decryption works, they're validating that the offset is set, and each of the kits as you ransom them are individualized to these affiliates, so that there's no fighting between affiliates and groups and people taking over or pretending to be the ransomware actor and getting a bad reputation for not being able to recover the files or being a fake recovery service. So all of these things they've actually thought through from a business process, which is also very interesting in how they're doing this. And so as you're starting to deal with this, maybe if you do have to pay, hopefully you are paying one of the better ransomware groups that have spent time and money on development and resources.
Well,
I
and
don't
it's
know.
definitely a business now, right, Tyler? I mean, and these ransomware groups, they will drop and disappear, and then the people behind those will kind of appear in other groups as well. But it's really run as a business, and so the business is to make money, and their goal is to make sure that, like you said, Tyler, that they can recover so that they can have this sort of ransomware Yelp review of, yeah, it was recoverable. But the fact that you have ransomware as a service is very concerning as well, right, Tyler? So how does that work?
100%. And the fact that ransomware as a service platform, your ability to just, buy ransom and go install this and get paid, that's lent to, especially with a lot of the Eastern European blocks, a lot of the sanctions happening. You see a large influx of very technical people or people that have had access to things start to look for ways to make money that may not be otherwise available. And so as you do consider the payment methods, you really have a couple major things to consider. One, you really do need to notify law enforcement and any regulatory body that you may be falling under for your vertical. Those are very important things to work with. In fact, many of the cyber insurance filings that you're going to be doing, if you do not work with the appropriate authorities or appropriate groups or utilize the companies that the insurance has on retainer and has approved as a valid recovery team, they may not cover it as part of your cyber insurance policy. And so you have to make sure you notify the appropriate people, look at your regulatory bodies who you have to report this to. You also want to take into account that the ransomware as a service is only one part of this. The initial access brokers and the botnets in which they're able to deploy the ransomware, the execution of those are two separate groups, and they will maintain access, persistence, and the botnet within inside of your organization, so that time to detection and time to remediation delta becomes very, very important in this game. You may be able to remove the ransomware, recover your files, but you have not cleaned the infection or gotten the initial access and method of compromise fixed. So you need to ensure that this is a holistic solution, and you've went through this as part of your tabletop, your playbook, in order to understand and ensure that you are covering all the bases, not just the ransom portions, not just the infection, not just the decryption pieces, but you're looking at the initial access vectors and all of the places and logs that should be identified in order to mitigate and recover from this. So ensuring that's there.
And certainly a breach is a breach, right, Tyler? So I think that's
breach
the
is a
point we're
breach.
trying to make. Like you talking about these different ways that the access could happen. But if there's a vulnerability, and I'm using vulnerability more broadly, if there's a vulnerability and a way that someone could access a system remotely, or either get onto the corporate network, or even get into their cloud environment, like a breach is a breach. And I think that one of the key things that I want to underscore with at least this panel is that if one person is able to find that and get access, another person could too. So just because, as Tyler said, there's these access brokers, there could be multiple that actually have access to the same system. So you could pay a ransom from one group, and then another group ends up ransoming you again because that initial access point hasn't been closed, right, Tyler?
Yes, and one of the other things that no one talks about, which I think is funny, I've actually not heard it brought up at all in most circles, is the fact that the data that is being extorted and the information that is out, that has been leaked. That is now breached. Do we think that ransomware groups do not keep backups? Do we not think that there's sharing of that? Like, yes, it's not been leaked publicly on the shame site, but that does not mean you do not need to do the risk evaluation on the data that is now out and realize the kind of people that you're dealing with. These are criminals. We'll be real. We're not even going to use the word hacker. We're going to recover the word hacker because I think that's a misnomer. These are criminals. And so you really do have to think about what people you're dealing with and where that data is going to end up. So you have to look at the risk, look at what was leaked, and evaluate that from a business standpoint. And back to the pay thing, there was a great comment inside of the chat. With the new sanctions against Russia and a lot of these groups operating out of an Eastern Bloc country, or we'll be real, operating under the guise of a a criminal organization with inside Russia with potential state backings. Like we're going to say that's a thing. You have to be very careful for who and how you do the negotiation. And if you are paying, you really do need to go through appropriate channels, like the FBI needs to get involved in order to avoid criminal implications to you and your company and liability because of the sanctions that are now in place and who you're paying. Those are things that need to be considered. So we really have to start to get to a place where we're able, as business owners, as enterprise admins, we need to understand this threat landscape. We need to understand and have plans in place in order to deal with this, because this is not going away. We've seen an increase of, let's see, this last year, I think we've seen an increase of, 62% increase in ransoms. And it seems like the news is let down. We've not seen as many high-profile ones. That's not the case. We're even in Q2, we're seeing records being broken year over year for the number of ransoms, and we're seeing again the sophistication of a lot of these actors, where they're putting image files and LNK files in ISOs to avoid mark of the web and delivering these via a email thread that they've hijacked. Like that 3 years ago was a APT, that was a sophisticated nation state attack. Now this is the general MO for many of these threat actors. So we have to step up and realize what the risks are and what the threat landscape is, so that we're prepared as the defenders trying to deal with these type of threats. And these are not the only threats that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, and that doesn't even account for the complexities and integrations and SaaS and all the new technologies that you're getting questions from the board and executives. Those are all integrations that have to happen. I mean, your AAD Connect, Azure cloud migration, and O365 integration, and life cycle of legacy Connect stuff. Like all of these things are happening. You still have to think about ransomware, and now you still have all of the other threats on top of that. So it is not an easy game for the defenders today, and we really have to start to think through and make this easier, so this is less of a resource constraint and pressure on the organization in order to make strides forward in better security maturity.
Yeah, and I think that, Tyler, one of the things that helps, I think we have a lot of people that are probably scared of ransomware, and I can understand that. But I think one of the things that helps is that, again, this initial access, this initial methodology by which ransomware can actually take hold in the organization, that methodology is very similar, if not the same methods as what's been used by attackers, be they APT or what have you. So the same, I like to emphasize the fact that the same security guidance and recommendations to improve the security posture of the organization, be that on-prem as well as the cloud, helps protect against both ransomware and your other type of attackers. Do you find that to be an accurate statement, Tyler?
I 100% agree with that. And I mean, that really goes back to what we were talking about earlier. And I was curious your thoughts around, like, why do you think we are not seeing a lot of the fundamentals dealt with over the last 20 years? Because the fundamentals, if we look at what ransomware uses and what actually stops them, block some macros, put some firewalls in place, eliminate local admin, do some segmentation with firewalls. All those seem and sound easy, I know, from an operation standpoint. Those are not as easy as they sound, but there are a lot of those that there's no good reason in many organizations to have the configurations they have. I mean, we've had the ability to block GPOs since Office 2010, where we had ADMX files that allowed us to block macros, and now it's integrated. We've got granular control with these GPOs and attack surface reduction rules. Like, we had these easy wins. Why are we not seeing that?
Yeah, that's a great point, Tyler. I mean, we used to, as part of, in the early days of our Active Directory security assessment, we used to actually scan for macro settings in GPOs, and we used to highlight if there weren't. We removed that and just replaced it with, you should be blocking macros, because we found maybe 10% or less of the customers that we looked at actually had any sort of macro controls. I was glad to see that Office eventually had enabled some control around, mark of the web, where macros wouldn't be enabled automatically for that. Now having the capabilities to actually block some of these older things like Excel 4 or 5, like, it just doesn't make sense to have that capability. I mean, macros, put simply, are code. And if you can run that code, if your Word document can spawn a command shell or run PowerShell, like, that just doesn't seem like that's necessary from an Office perspective, especially from your standard Office worker perspective. I think macros, there's a lot of ways to get some quick wins around macros. The challenge is definitely going to be in HR and finance who use macros. I certainly, as a consulting company, Trimarc has come across some macros that have been sent to us, and we've actually had to remove macros or work with the customer to adjust that. But they've been part of that workflow for years. You know, you get an Excel file that has macros that will automatically adjust things and information and data points within the Excel file as you go through it. That can be very helpful and useful. But of course, getting an Excel file with macros from someone just across the internet that you might not have dealt with before should be dealt with suspicion. I think that one thing that organizations can do as a quick win around this is do some discovery, especially around HR, finance, contracts, and see what their use of macros are. Do they have files that they know use macros? Certainly Office has gotten better about at least saying, hey, there's macros in this file. They might not actually block it by default, but at least they say that there are some. So they should have some awareness around that. But for your standard Office worker, there really shouldn't be any reason for them to use documents with macros, except for I ran across one thing that was very interesting around macros is that one organization that we worked with, we helped them and helped them block macros across the environment. And there was one user, a power user, who had set a macro within Outlook that was basically filtering email into folders, and it was like their power rule engine. And that blocked that person. So there are going to be some weird one-offs when you start working to block macros, but certainly that is one of the things that can be very effective. Certainly leveraging also some sort of email system. Most of the email security systems now have the ability to sort of explode or open files in sort of a VM for that initiated environment just for that check. Those can check and do some quick basic checks. Obviously, the more advanced ones are going to bypass that because they'll do virtual checks, et cetera. But that can be very helpful. We've talked about some of the quick wins. Like I said, looking at admin group membership, certainly for Active Directory, but also Azure AD is important too. When we do our Microsoft Cloud Security Assessment, which covers Azure AD, we tend to find a lot of user accounts in privileged roles, in Azure AD roles. We are seeing that more and more people are starting to use Azure AD Privileged Identity Management, but even the ones that are, most of them that use PIM are using permanent membership, which is not really helpful because the other problem is a lot of people, when they're administering whatever system it is, be it SharePoint or Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Exchange Online, they're still using the web browser that they use for everything else, which means that their token, their proof of identity to the Azure AD system or any cloud system is usually stored in a cookie. It's stored in that browser. So if an attacker is able to take advantage of that browser, compromise that browser, they can extract that information and reuse that token. And at least in the Azure AD system, they have about an hour in order to leverage that access to do whatever they need to impersonate that user. Things like PIM can limit that because you don't have full-time access. You have to elevate through PIM. You have access with an updated token for a certain amount of time and only in that session in which you're able to do what you need to do. These are things that are definitely foundational that should be in place. We certainly recommend them. Also, the default rights that users have in Azure AD are not necessary, such as the ability to register applications, the ability to consent to all apps, et cetera. So there's a number of things that are foundational, like we said, that can be done to help with this. And I want to just kind of open it up to the group here to see anyone that's on this call. Please feel free to come off mute or go ahead and post in the chat. If there's things that you found that have been helpful, or things that you found that were a little easier than you thought they would be, or what are some of the challenges that you have that are difficult to get some of these things in place. Certainly, I know legacy is a thing that continues with us. The technical debt of the things and decisions that were made before. Maybe it's often getting budget or getting resources to do something. I mean, we're every company that we've seen is resource constrained, from the Fortune 10 on out to the few hundred user company that may have one person that's doing IT and security. And certainly we've had conversations with those folks. So feel free to come off mute or go ahead and post in the chat if you have some feedback on that. And I'll just pause for
Yeah.
about 20 seconds.
So
Okay, we have in the chat. Sorry, go ahead, Brandon. Go ahead and take
I was
that.
just going to mention that. So yeah, in the chat, Paul, I think, and Mike and Jim were doing a good job talking to him too, is kind of evaluating what you were talking about, is the risk of not doing something, like going through change management and trying to enforce that you're trying to do what's better for the institution. And the question is always, well, what's going to break, right? Or what's this going to impact? And proving that risk of not doing something is incredibly difficult, I think, to do. Certainly for things like macros or using PIM and stuff like that. It's like, oh, well, somebody could leverage this, or you know, if they don't do it the right way, then. So I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, that's actually a really great point, Brandon. I certainly have recognized and talked before about the fact that nobody gets fired for not removing a service account from domain admins, right? But if you removed it from domain admins without understanding what the capability is or what it requires from a permission perspective, that could break a business system. Now, why a business system would have a service account that's a member of domain admins is beyond me. We've certainly seen a lot of wacky things during our assessments, especially on the AD side. I used to say that we've seen just about everything, and then in the past year, I have to retract that. We continue to see a lot of wacky things. Some things that we've seen, I believe, are probably persistence from attackers that have been in the environment. And we've talked to the customers. Now, our assessments are not compromise assessments, but certainly when we see some very interesting permissions for like default groups that shouldn't be there, that an admin, we have a lot of folks on the team that have been in operations for many years, and we have conversations about these things. We're like, would you ever configure this as an admin? And we're like, no, there's no reason to ever do that. Then yeah, it's probably some sort of persistence or something else. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that was put in the chat is protected users group. Not a silver bullet, but it seemed to make a huge difference. Protected users is something that we recommend that all Active Directory admin accounts. So Trimarc says AD admins, we need members of the domain administrators group, domain admins, enterprise admins, and any subgroups. So all recursive membership of those groups. Effectively, your domain administrators group will contain domain admins and enterprise admins. So it covers everything really. All of the most highly privileged accounts end up as members of that group somehow or some way. So if you ensure that all of those accounts are members of protected users, now you'll have to test your service accounts, though again, why service accounts would need those is another story. But protected users really restricts the authentication capability of those accounts. It removes the ability to use NTLM, so no more NTLM relay for those accounts, technically. Kerberos AES only. It removes cache credentials, shortens up the ticket lifetime. So there's a number of controls and protections around what protected users provides. So we recommend that for all AD admins as our standard recommendation. Additionally, look to also add additional admins to it, but there could be some potential issues because delegation may be required, which is another big benefit of protected users. Protected users will, if you put these accounts into protected users, you'll be able to stop the majority of delegation attacks against those accounts, if not all of them. And so
along those lines too, Sean, I just wanted to, one of the caveats it's listed in the article, but is, and I don't remember if you mentioned service accounts and computer accounts for that group. They're not advised to go into that, and they're honestly not advised to be a domain admin or a privileged admin regardless. But I also wanted to kind of take that quick moment to talk a little bit about, so we say put your admins in the privileged users groups. And I think a lot of what we're talking about here too is where to start. So, and I think you start with the admins. Tyler and I were talking a little bit earlier, and as I started to kind of prepare for the webcast a little bit, one of the realizations I had is a lot of times, so your administrators are your biggest target. So threat actors are going to go after, the biggest bang for their bucks. They're going to want to get those accounts. And a lot of times it's also the easiest to start with those. So if you're doing things like implementing MFA for the first time, or you're trying to roll out a new password policy, you're trying to do password filtering or auditing, implementing it on your domain admins or on your privileged users or on those crown jewels first, both is the easiest way to do it. It's also going to mitigate your biggest risk.
Yeah.
You really do need to think about what those risks are to the business and articulate that in a business fashion. Because again, none of this applies if you can't articulate this at the top, your top-down approach, right? You need this to come from the top. You need to get the buy-in, and telling people what to do usually doesn't work. Getting them to understand why they're doing what they need to do is a much more fruitful activity. If you go to the extent of, you know, putting some figures and numbers on some of this, I mean, there's some great numbers out there between Unit 42 and Digital Shadows. I think Trend Micro has a couple ransomware bits, but the average ransom, I think in 2021 initially started at almost $3 million. That was the initial demand. You know, with demands all the way up to 5 million. So you look at the cost of not doing some of these things, you can really start to put dollar amounts on this, because most of this is now public. And you look at the average payment and payout, even from the small ones up, and I think 185,000 is the average, and that's, you know, some of these are only $1,000 ransoms. So you imagine how many you're looking at between all of these. The cost of not doing some of this to an organization, not to mention business reputation, the rebuild, the downtime, and all of the things that must take place after. These are just the ransom costs, which can be articulated and quantified very easily with a lot of the data we have. So making sure that you're articulating that properly in business lingo to your executives so that they understand the cost of not buying in and not helping push this, and really getting the buy-in of your employees. You don't want to go out of business. There's a great spreadsheet out on one of the forums now that shows many of the businesses that have went under as either the last thread or partially because of a ransom and a ransom demand and the payments thereafter. And it's well over 200 companies. So this is not a small issue, and really there's no point in arguing over technology if you're out of business. And that is some points to kind of bring up and articulate from a business standpoint.
Yeah, and the security side does cost, right? There's a cost to it. There's a cost to securing. The improving security is going to make operations more painful, unfortunately. That's the reality of it, which I think is a part of the reason why a lot of these things have been kicked, you know, this can has been kicked down the road, so to speak. So real quick, Tyler, I don't know if I heard you give an answer for the percentage of people that actually pay ransoms or companies that pay ransom, but I imagine it's like in the high 70 or 80%.
I believe it's 62%. If I'm going off of one of the stats in my head from one of the things I've read and kind of kept track of, I think the ones that have went public, that are public based on the ransom, because not all ransomware is public, right? The ones that are public and the ones that have publicly stated that they have paid, I think it was like 62%. And that is not a full payment. That may be a payment for a portion of the data or what's been negotiated or what's been part of it, because there are interactions with FBI in order to pay, in order to find wallets, in order to seize and recover the assets later. So there's a lot of nuance to that number, but yes, there is numbers around that.
Yeah, so there's a great question about what did you do if AD is compromised? Do you burn down the entire forest? Do you have advice on how to contain the situation, remove the threat? So the number one thing that you're going to do is reach out to a reputable incident response company and have them scope the incident, identify what needs to be done. I've worked on a number of breaches, some pretty large ones with some IR firms. They are the best. They have the tools to identify what is actually going on. What is the attacker doing? What have they compromised? What have they done? From Microsoft's perspective, you need to replace all your hardware and recreate the forest. Nobody ever does that, to my knowledge. It's really, really difficult to do that. A lot will try to figure out something in between. But ultimately, it is a lot cheaper, as Tyler said, to go ahead and implement security and security budget today instead of paying that 180,000 plus money to a third party that has accidentally taken control, or purposely taking control. I call it the accidental outsourcing of your administration of your environment. Now you have a third party that's administering your environment, has control of it. Interestingly enough, a number of years ago, I put together a Black Hat talk with a couple of other folks One person was a red team lead for a Fortune 5 company, and the other was one of the top mainframe hackers in the world. And we put together a talk of building on the concept of Die Hard. I think it was Die Hard 4's fire sale, where basically if you can get a whole bunch of systems and take them down at the same time or control them at the same time, then no one really knows what to do and there's no control of it. So we put together a theoretical attack, sort of like the entire organization, entire company as a fire sale. And we figured out how this would look, and we put it together as a talk and submitted it to Black Hat and DEF CON. It wasn't accepted, and I can kind of understand why, because it's a very big topic, and there was a lot that we could have talked about. And probably, I don't even know if we could have fit it into 45 or 50-minute time frame. But effectively, we figured out how to synchronize up everything to the point where, with initial access to a system, we could then compromise Active Directory, compromise the mainframe system, and effectively hold the entire thing ransom. That is possible today. And I expect at this point that that's going to shift to the cloud as well. All the APIs are there. They're accessible. And as from what we've seen on our Azure AD security assessments, security is very bad at a lot of organizations, with regular users being members of highly privileged admin groups, including global admins, no MFA configured, and still a lot of organizations not blocking legacy auth. That means that's vulnerable, as well as those organizations that have on-prem accounts that have highly privileged rights within Azure AD. That leads to a big problem where you have one domino that falls and all the others fall from that. I don't know, Tyler, you want to add to that?
Yeah, funny you say that. That is kind of the next iteration that we're already seeing, and this is what they're calling the triple extortion, where they're essentially negotiating. If negotiations aren't going well, they begin to do denial of service and or take things offline through destructive methods. And we've even seen this down to the destructive level, right? Like we've seen a lot of the stuff with Ukraine when that came out. We've got destructive wipers that are now capable and built into many of the kits that are out there. Now, a lot of these are not within inside the ransomware kits, but they're within inside of the botnets or the exploit kits or the C2 kits that are being leveraged by these attackers. But the destructive nature and ability to do that as part of the ransom negotiation in order to ensure the affiliates get their money, but also the ransomware gangs get their money, which are in cahoots with the botnets and the initial access brokers. All of this ecosystem, they will leverage the tools that they have. And the wipers are one mechanism they're leveraging, denial of services as another through other botnets, and beginning to force the hand of, hey, your systems are down, your stuff's ransomed. Now you have no choice other than to come back to the negotiating table. And by the way, we've increased the ransom cost. And so this triple extortion is something we are definitely seeing, and it is starting to be built into not only that, the cloud aspect that you talked about, the session tokens. We now see pieces within inside the toolkits to be able to steal session tokens and browser history, dump add-ons for password vaults, all of those things for cloud access and SaaS app access in order to take over that account and basically deny admins access back into that, and denial of service against your SaaS application because you can't access it. So these things are stuff that is being built into the kits as we speak. So you really do need to get ahead of that and kind of consider what your risk and threat profile looks like from your cloud, as well as the denial of service and destructive nature.
Yeah, and the ransomware actors have realized that if they go after the system that controls and handles everything else, that's the easiest path there. So VMware has been attacked pretty extensively. And when you think about what runs on VMware in your modern enterprise, that's like every server now. There's very few, if any, physical servers anymore. Probably some pretty big databases and things like that were probably still physical. For pretty much everything else, including your Active Directory domain controllers, a lot of your access control systems, which could include something like CyberArk or Secret Server, likely virtualized as well. So what this means is that they go after VMware and control that, then they control everything else. Just like if they go after Azure, they go after AWS. And from what we've seen, a lot of times the Azure administration controls of the subscriptions, controls of the VMs, the virtual instances there, as well as in AWS, are often controlled with on-prem accounts that are either sync or linked to that cloud environment. So the attacker can go after and control VMware, and you could leverage something like Log4j vulnerability to get into the VMware system, or just from what we've seen in our typical VMware configurations where vCenter is accessible on the network. They have not protected or isolated the network into these systems, or even through something like an ILO or iDRAC system where that's available on the network and is not on an out-of-band network, which we've seen as well. There's a number of attacks against those. I know when I was an admin, I pretty much never did firmware updates for servers because I wanted to keep that server up and running. So what this means is ILO and iDRAC, those updates, those security updates only happen when the firmware updates happen. And from what I've seen from our customers, they don't tend to do firmware updates unless there's a hardware failure and they have to get that vendor involved. Then they end up doing the firmware updates and getting those updates. And we've identified some serious security issues that goes into physical systems that could be hosting, so something like a Hyper-V server, or even some of your admin forced or special critical systems that are only going to be in physical, having things like ILO or iDRAC that's on the actual corporate network itself. So there are definitely a number of things that need to be approached and looked at. I would say one of the most important things you can do as we look towards wrapping this up, we've got about 4 minutes left in this webcast, is making sure that you do evaluations review of your admins. So Active Directory, Azure AD, VMware. Basically, think of your critical systems, the systems that actually control access to other things. Start with those, figure out who your admins are. The other thing we look at pretty closely as part of our Active Directory security assessment is what are the agents that are on domain controllers? And we have a discovery method to do this. And when we do our assessments, we do not have admin rights. So there are some scripts that we provide the customer to run so we can capture some information from the domain controllers, et cetera. But we are identifying what the agents are, and then we're looking at those. And oftentimes we found remote control agents that are vulnerable. We have found systems or software that has remote access capability that are vulnerable. So these things are running on domain controllers today. So it's important to understand what's running on your DCs, what are those agents, are there things that shouldn't be there, as well as looking at the VMware system, making sure that you're running current versions of VMware tools across your VMs, because there's vulnerable versions of that. As we move from 6, 6, 5, 7, and newer in VMware, the newer VMware tools are available to install, but don't happen automatically. So that's another important thing to look at. Certainly something we look at as part of our VMware security assessment. So as far as wrapping up in a few minutes, closing thoughts, I'm going to go to Brandon first.
Sorry, my brain is spinning right now, trying to follow all the chats and everything too. Closing thoughts. So
a couple of things people could do to help secure their environment.
Yeah, so I'm trying to go through a couple notes of things that we didn't touch on. And I think we touched on a lot. I mean, kind of just in the 30 minutes, we were worried about filling content. So one thing that I don't think really did get touched on, well, I think it got touched on a little bit, but removing local administrator rights, I talked before about starting with the admins. I was a domain admin. I removed my own local administrative rights on my PAW. So it was always, if I can do it, you can do it type mentality. I know selling it's hard, like with everything. One other quick and easy thing, if you don't already have a method of rolling your local administrator accounts, so using Laps or something like a CyberArk or anything else, I don't think that was touched on. That's a big win, I think, as far as lateral movement. Final thought is mostly just, I always think of ransomware as starting with or actually only really being the initial access. So it's the phishing email, it's the VPN password spray. But many times that's just the first piece of the puzzle. I think it used to be the only piece of the puzzle where, they'd get in, they'd drop it, and then just kind of see what chaos happened. And I think anymore, it's becoming a lot more of that more targeted attack. It's the initial access is just that first step. It's the lateral movement after that. And that's where Laps comes in. That's where local admin comes in. And then protecting and hardening your domain controllers and tier 0 assets. We also didn't mention things like SCCM or ADCS or your Azure AD Connect computer server, sorry. Those are all essentially tier 0 or tier 0 adjacent. So those are going to be major targets for a ransomware attack.
Yeah, it's a great point, Brandon. Thanks for hitting on those core sort of foundational things that should be done and can be done. Certainly, we covered a lot of this in our June webcast, which is on our Trimarc YouTube channel. The other thing that I want to add to that is, when you are looking through these things and figuring out what the things are to do, there are low-hanging fruit that you can work through to get resolved. Figuring out what needs to be done, it starts with evaluating the environment, how things are configured, who has access to things, and then going from there. So I'll pass it to Tyler for some closing thoughts.
No, those are all great. I mean, really getting back to the fundamentals, attackers are going after your end users through social engineering, phishing. So make sure you're educating everyone, not expecting your end users to have that. Like, there should be technology in place to protect your end users. Their job is not to know the security. Our job is to protect them, but educating them is always a good way to get buy-in, get everyone on the same team, get the why across the organization, so you build that security culture from the ground up. Ensuring that you really do understand and keep up with some of the threat actors. All of the threat actors are now cross-platform. They support ESXi, they support Mac OS, Linux. All of these are now built into just about every one of the ransomware kits. You look at Black Cat or Deadbolt, like, the cross functionality is going to become a real thing. And so ensuring that your security is not just focused around your Windows devices or Active Directory. Traditionally, these have been the low-hanging fruit. That is less the case now. So everything from your VPN to your exposed authentication, your SaaS providers, ensuring there's MFA on those, down to your Jamf and Mac OS executives and marketing department that require that MacBook or iPad. So those are things to consider as we start to see that landscape shift. And really make sure that you reach out to people in the community, friends of any of the companies that you work with. Any of us are always available. We're all on the same team. This is a losing battle without everyone collaborating, sharing what they can, lessons learned, and ways to improve this. We need to really bring back some of the innovation within inside of this community and ensure that we're all starting to work together. And mentoring the next generation to come up. There's not enough of us, and many of us have been doing this for a while, and that means we may not last forever. So ensuring that we are doing that mentoring and giving back to the community wherever we can is also important.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Brandon. We are up on time. Thank you very much for joining us today, spending an hour with us on your Thursday. Really appreciate it. If you like this format, if you like what we were covering, please let us know on Twitter. There will be a eval form that goes out to those who registered. Again, thank you very much for your time. We are going to continue to do more of these. I think we're probably going to be doing an Ask Us Anything with the Trimarc team about what we've seen in assessments and recommendations around things. But really appreciate everyone joining us. We want to continue to engage with the community and talk about these things, and maybe together we can help solve some of these harder problems. So thank you very much. A few of us will hang out for a few more minutes if anyone has any further questions that we can answer. But at this point, we are closing our webcast. So thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. Have a good one.